Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with Paul Marshall, a barrister active participant in the post office scandal. Paul, good to see you. Thank you very much for sparing me some time.
Hello, Tony.
Um, let's get into the nitty-gritty about the scandal. The public inquiry has been running since summer 2021. How did you get involved in the first place?
It's a rather strange story and rather surprising. Um, my practice, my background is in business and commercial law, and in 2017, I was taken rather seriously ill with metastatic cancer, which was quite serious, and I basically ceased my previous practice and took a lot of time out. And in 2020, I was recuperating, and I read the judgments, 2019 actually, the judgments of 2020. I read the judgments of Sir Peter Fraser in the Horizon Issues trial, and I was very astonished by it. I've been interested for a long time in the way in which large institutions are able to outflank the justice system, and I wrote a rather long article about it called "Denialism," and that was published by the Parliamentary Fair Banking Group. As a result of that, somebody reached out to me and said, "Well, this is very interesting. Your comments about the post office story are very interesting. Would you like to meet some of the victims?" And I said I would. Um, that was during lockdown. I was introduced to Seema Misra, Janet Skinner, and Tracy Felsted, and we talked about what had happened to them. And I was so shocked and appalled by what I heard. In particular, all three of them, but Tracy Felsted had been imprisoned at the age of 19 uh, as a result of a shortfall of, I can't remember the exact figure, but a few £1,000s that her family had actually repaid to the post office. She was imprisoned at the age of 19. And I asked her how much she'd received out of the £57 million compensation that had been paid by the post office at the end of the great group litigation involving 550 people in 2019. And she told me that she'd received £17,000 for her time in prison, during which period she'd encountered a fellow inmate hanging.
God.
I was so shocked by that
Yeah.
that I said to her and Janet and Seema that I basically had time on my hands, and I said I would do anything I could to assist them should they wish to use my services to overturn their convictions. I'm not a criminal barrister, but I know quite a lot of law, and I thought it would be I thought it would be a walk in the park, really, knowing what I then knew. 5 years later, here we are, and I'm still up to my neck in it.
Seema Misra was, of course, the first postmistress to be put into prison. She was pregnant at the time, and it seems to be absolutely dreadful that that should have happened to her. And
Well,
of course, she was the first of many.
she wasn't the first. She wasn't the first. She's arguably one of the most, well, she is the most publicly prominent of those who've
Mm.
been prosecuted. The post office has been prosecuting its postmasters since the rollout of the Horizon system in 1999. She was prosecuted in 2010, but her case is very important because it was the first case in which the post office had prosecuted a case for theft, and it had, as it were, went all the way with expert evidence given at her trial, which was long. And as you say rightly, she was convicted and sentenced to immediate imprisonment, much to her shock. In circumstances where she was completely confident that she would be acquitted. She knew she'd done nothing wrong, and she thought the sort of, as it were, the trusty British legal system
Mm.
would ensure her safety and acquittal, and it completely failed. And in a sense, her case is the sort of archetype of how so many things went wrong.
Paul, was part of the problem the fact that the post office has the right to prosecute people without going through the Crown Prosecution Service?
That's absolutely a central part of the story. There are many as is not surprising, an enormously complicated scandal and tragedy of this kind. There are a number of intersecting threads, but one of them is certainly the historical anomaly that the Post Office was a very powerful prosecuting and indeed investigating authority. And also, a part of that is, although it's technically and was under Royal Mail, it's a private company. Legally, it's in effect an arm of the state.
Yeah.
By the turn of the 20th century, the two arms of the state visible to most people would have been the police and the post office. And the post office is one of the oldest investigating authorities in the world. Now, the point that you touch on is terribly important. One of the explanations for what happened is that the post office was both it was three things. It was the victim of what it said were alleged crimes, theft by its postmasters taking money from it. It was the investigator of those alleged offences. And thirdly, it was also the prosecutor. It assumed the mantle of the state. Prosecuting offences is a state function. And by an anomaly in English law, which doesn't apply in Scotland or Ireland, there are private prosecutions. Now, so you had basically a failure of independence across those three functions. Ordinarily, the investigating arm, typically the police, is separate from the prosecuting authority,
Yeah.
which typically is the Crown Prosecution Service. Now, and the third thing is that the Post Office had an overriding commercial interest in the problem that had arisen, namely that it had a major problem with its Horizon system, which had a propensity to cause shortfalls at branch post offices. When I say shortfalls, account balance mismatches. Now, it knew that from the get-go. And to touch on another problem which fed into all of this, there's so many problems and so many threads. When the Post Office took over the Horizon system from what was then called ICL, but became Fujitsu Services in 1999, it rolled it out. It rolled it out to 17,000 branches. It was the largest networked computer system in Europe at that time of a non-military kind. It was essentially experimental. The Post Office and Fujitsu knew from the get-go, as it were, that the software wasn't reliable. It had a propensity to cause these losses. What was done was that contractually, under the agreements with postmasters had to make good losses identified at their branches. Now, the Post Office wasn't going to tell its postmasters that it had, as it were, a rubbishy computer system that had a propensity to cause shortfalls, account mismatches, and the liability was cast, as I say, contractually onto the postmaster, which was a terrible thing, really, because what you have here is a large commercial organization, essentially a state organization, which transferred the commercial risk in its product to the people least able to bear it, i.e. individual postmasters.
Yeah.
Without their knowledge. They thought they were entering into a sort of collaborative venture, being a postmaster with this great trusty institution, which is great distinguished history in this country, and they would be, as it were, looked after. But in effect, from the outset, they were exploited and disadvantaged by the Post Office.
And is it true that the investigators would go around and say to a specific postmaster, it's only you, nobody else has got this problem?
Well, they did two things, really. That was one, and that's achieved a certain notoriety and public prominence. But the other thing that they did, the Post Office Investigations Department, as I say, is a very long established investigations organization, and it effectively was answerable to no one. And the result of that, it had over years accumulated a long list of bad practices, which were entirely outside and inconsistent with the protections that have been brought in for normal police investigations under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, uh, uh, and that was introduced in 1984 as a result of well-known abuse of police investigation powers in, for instance, the Guildford Six, the Birmingham Six, and Guildford
Yeah.
Four, and so on. But what the Post Office did when it investigated those against whom it alleged shortfalls was to say, you have a shortfall of £10,000. If you do not pay that back now, i.e., immediately this week, by giving us a check, we will prosecute you for theft, stroke false accounting, and you will go to prison.
Yeah.
And the consequence of that, now I'm just giving the example of £10,000, but the figures range between 10,000 more than £100,000. And the result of that is that postmasters who were subject to post office investigations were firstly terrified and intimidated, and secondly, as often as not, paid up. But many didn't, and some stood their ground, like Seema Misra.
Yeah.
And she said, I have done nothing wrong. I'm not going to plead guilty to something that I haven't done. You can take me to court. And of course, the police, the post office did so. But there are two, as you say, there are two elements. Well, the important element is, well, a very important element is you're the only one. So they felt isolated.
Yeah.
And that was, of course, very exploitative and enabled the post office, to use a phrase, to pick off its postmasters one by one. And the great thing that Alan Bates did, and the thing that really is if you like, his badge of honor, the reason he deserves so much admiration, is that he organized those who he contacted who'd had these kind of experiences and brought them all together. And when they met for the first time, they were all absolutely staggered that there were so many other people who had had the same experience as they had, because they'd been told they're the only one. And very frequently, understandably, people were shamed by the legal proceedings that were brought against them and pleaded guilty and tried to move on with their lives as best they could. And when, of course, the numbers involved became apparent, that was the crystallizing event, if you like, the catalyst for what became the group litigation. There were eventually 550. But in truth, we now know that there are thousands of post office victims. It prosecuted upwards of 1,000, but there are many, many others who lost their businesses as a result of these allegations made against them.
He certainly deserved the knighthood. But
Certainly.
was it a little bit skeptical on the part of somebody to try and close him down a bit? Because it hasn't worked.
Well, no, he was quite plainly the wrong man to pick a fight with, wasn't
Yeah.
he? And Mr. Justice Fraser says that in his in one of his judgments, that he was astonishingly resolute, and that certainly can be said of him. But he provided leadership at a moment when it was vitally necessary. And if you like, you might say the rest is history. But there are a few people in this story who provided that kind of leadership. The parliamentarian involved was James Arbuthnot, Lord Arbuthnot.
Yeah.
And the other two critical figures in the story who perhaps haven't received the attention, possibly the honour that they deserve, are Ron Warmington and Ian Henderson, the forensic accountants of Second Sight, because it was they who basically in 2013 lifted the lid. They just prized open a little bit the lid on what had happened, and it was that that, in a sense, triggered all that followed between 2013 and 2019, when eventually the entire story was exposed. Well, a significant part of the story was exposed in the two important judgments of Mr. Justice Fraser. But that was a very important period.
So Second Sight came in as a sort of independent investigator stroke auditor to try and establish why things were going wrong. Did the post office at that stage totally accept their comments, or do we have a situation where effectively they sort of once again pushed it under the carpet?
It's a very, very interesting question to which the answer is not entirely straightforward. I think the reality is that the Post Office, in appointing Second Sight as the reviewers of Horizon, which they did in I think 2012 in response to just enormously increasing parliamentary pressure. There were an endless stream of questions being asked of the Post Office by MPs on behalf of their constituents. And it was, in a sense, driven to appointing forensic accountants. And they appointed Second Sight, I think, because there was a personal connection with Ron Warmington, very experienced accountant, sometime head of a fraud department in a large retail bank. They were appointed, I think, because the Post Office thought they were, as it were, a small outfit, and they would be able to, as it were, manage them.
Yeah.
Well, that was a first order miscalculation because they weren't able to manage them. And what Second Sight did in 2013 was to provide in summer 2013 was to provide an interim report. They'd, in a sense, been expected to provide a clean bill of health. And whilst they didn't make any very serious, as it were, allegations, they did say that they had seen evidence that suggested that there were bugs in Horizon that were consistent with the kind of problems that postmasters had experienced. They had also identified one particular bug called the receipts and payments mismatch bug, which, as its name suggests, was and became, if you like, the most important bug eventually identified by Mr. Justice Fraser in 2019. But also, terribly importantly, they said that they had identified a conflict of interest on a really fundamental problem that the Post Office had, which was, I say problem, it's a sort of evidential problem, which was that Second Sight had been given to understand that the Post Office and Fujitsu, the supplier of the system, had the capacity, the facility to remotely access Post Office branch accounts and edit transactions and edit them and inject transactions into those accounts remotely. Now, it's pretty obvious, just stating it in those terms, that if that was true, it raised a very, very serious question about the integrity of the Post Office's evidence to criminal and civil courts about what was going on. Because if unbeknownst to a postmaster, the supplier of the computer system had been tinkering with their branch accounts, whether to make repairs or adjustments or whatever, that rather pulled the carpet from under the Post Office's contention, which was, as it were, the mainstay of all its prosecutions and indeed civil proceedings, that the evidence from the Horizon system was reliable and showed what it showed. Now, in a sense, documents produced to a court, with writing on them, are just documents. They're bits of paper with black marks on it. Yeah. And if there's a shortfall that is shown in a computer printout, on the face of it, you think, well, the arithmetic doesn't add up and therefore there's a shortfall. But if standing behind that, there's a bug or an adjustment that has been made about which the Post Office, postmaster knows nothing, then the whole thing unravels. So from 2013, when the Second Sight first identified that, up until 2019, when there was the huge group litigation, the Post Office was driven to denying that was possible. And it was basically a lie. So the Second Sight, that's a long answer to your question, but Second Sight identified all the fundamental problems with the Horizon system in 2013 that eventually emerged finally in the judgments in 2019. But there's a sort of dogleg to that, which is there was in 2015, February 2015, there was a a select committee hearing, what was then the a BEIS select committee, business select committee meeting, hearing in Parliament, at which Second Sight asked Parliament to direct that the Post Office should give Second Sight its prosecution files, because that
Yeah.
had been agreed as one of the terms when they were appointed in 2012. And Paula Venables and her one of her directors steadfastly refused, and they basically refused on the grounds that Second Sight weren't professionally qualified to look at the prosecution files. And what Second Sight was saying was, we don't really think that there's sufficient evidence for the kind of charges that have been brought against these postmasters over time. We're very doubtful about that. Well, anyway, they closed it down. The Post Office and Paula Venables steadfastly refused to provide those documents. And very shortly afterwards, the Post Office started to engineer the removal of Second Sight as reviewers of the Horizon system, and that happened in 2015, following which they were removed from the scene, and the mediation process by which the Post Office was talking about settling claims by postmasters came to a grinding halt, and that's when the great group litigation, which eventually met such success in 2019, as it were, kicked off. But so far as Second Sight are concerned, the great feather in their cap really is that one of the great feathers in their cap is that in 2013 they identified, 2013 and 2015, they identified correctly the problems that in 2021 formed the basis for the Court of Appeal quashing the convictions of 39 of 42 appellants in a completely unprecedented series of criminal appeals, the number of which I think is unprecedented in living memory.
Yeah. Can we move on to the public inquiry? Sir Wyn Williams was in charge. It ended in 24 in December, last December, after 3 years of evidence. What was the purpose of the inquiry, and did it achieve what you were hoping for?
Well, the second question can't be answered at the moment because we don't know what Sir Wyn Williams, the chair of the inquiry, is going to find. It did indeed finish in December 2024, having become a public inquiry in May, June of 2021, immediately following the Court of Appeal hearing, in which the Court of Appeal quashed the first 39 convictions that had been referred to it by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. So we don't know what the inquiry will establish, but its purpose, the purpose of a public inquiry, which is a statutory inquiry, originally, to give a little bit of background, originally Sir Wyn Williams had been appointed before the Court of Appeal hearings in 2021 to investigate the circumstances of what had happened. It became a full public, that is a statutory inquiry, in June 2021. Really, as a result of, this is just to give context, as a result of a very important finding by the Court of Appeal, which was that the Post Office had engaged in what's called second category abuse of process. Now, the Post Office in the appeals, again contextually, accepted that there had been a lot of disclosure failures, i.e. it hadn't told those it was prosecuting about its knowledge of bugs. But the second category abuse of process, which is a ground of criminal appeal, is that the Post Office was engaged in subverting the integrity of the justice system, criminal justice system, or undermining public confidence in it. It was that finding that, in my view at least, caused the government to have to concede the demand that it be a public inquiry. Now, the purpose of public inquiry is essentially threefold. Firstly, what happened? It's a fact-finding exercise. In a sense, above all, a public inquiry is a fact-finding exercise. Secondly, the remit of all public inquiries is to find out who was responsible and who knew what and who is to blame.
Yeah.
That's a very important function. And the third function is to identify how such things can't happen again. So that's, in a sense, in a nutshell, the threefold remit that Sir Wyn Williams has got in his inquiry. He's heard 3 years of evidence as to what has happened. So compressing that into a nutshell and speculating about what he's going to find is difficult. But I'll have a stab at it. The what happened, I've outlined already what happened in terms of the Horizon system, but it's not about the Horizon system ultimately. This is about government failure, um, post office institutional ethical failure. I'll just give one example of that. You've got thousands of people losing their businesses. You've got 1,000 people being prosecuted. They're all prosecuted on the basis of what is now known to be flawed and incomplete evidence. And that all takes place over a period of, in effect, let's say 20 years, 1919 to 2019. Not a single person in the post office or Fujitsu blew the whistle in relation, not a single employed person, not one person who is involved in these things. And we've heard evidence, for example, in the public inquiry has heard evidence. In Janet Skinner's case, the post office investigator in her case said to the inquiry that when she went to visit her branch and identified the shortfall, which was quite substantial, it was alleged to be about £70,000, she said she didn't believe that Janet Skinner had taken any money from the post office. She didn't think that there was any evidence of theft, but she was nonetheless prosecuted for theft and pleaded guilty to false accounting, with the effect that it's ruined her life. Now, that's extraordinary. It suggests to me, and I think one of the aspects of this is that there's a complete ethical institutional failure in the post office that ran from the top to the bottom, so that people were incapable of, as it were, identifying anything but the post office's own short-term and immediate commercial interests.
Okay, we're into our last 8 minutes, so we're going to have to speed up a little bit on some of it. The public expectation, obviously, the post office versus Mr. Bates, or Mr. Bates versus the post office, really brought it to the light of the public, didn't they?
It did, most certainly.
What do you think the public is hoping for? I mean, I know what I'm hoping for: full compensation for everyone. But that
Well,
remains
that
to be
ought to
seen.
be provided in any event, and indeed on the 8th of July, Sir Wyn Williams is going to deliver his first part of his inquiry report, which is on compensation, and it is certain that his view in relation to compensation is going to be very critical. The compensation process is extraordinarily long, and the object is to compensate those who've suffered swiftly and fully and fairly.
Yeah.
And the compensation arrangements at the moment have wholly failed to achieve that. What can be said is that a lot of small claims have been settled and people have accepted compensation. In my view, the majority of claims that have been settled, I suspect, would have been settled at an undervalue. No, to my knowledge, no very substantial claim or complex claim, that is, claims running to several millions of pounds for the losses suffered, have been successfully settled. And the process is supposed to be collaborative and straightforward. In fact, in my experience, it's anything but. It's like litigation without having the benefit of the discipline of a judge supervising the litigation and being a recourse available to the parties where things go wrong. Here we have a situation where effectively the government, the post office, and the post office's solicitors since 2019 have been running the compensation process themselves. And the fundamental problem with that is there's a proliferation of schemes. At one stage, there were four different schemes with four different criteria. And all those who are involved, in my view at least, have conflicts of interest. That is, the post office was as it were, the perpetrator of this scandal and injustice and the cause of harm, and yet it was involved heavily in paying out compensation to the victims. Well, that's not an ordinary circumstance. Most people would say it's like putting the fox in charge of the hen coop, which is, I think, an
Yeah, yeah,
analogy. And the government, of course, is the paymaster. It's the
yeah,
government who's forking out the money, so it's got a direct interest in paying as little as possible and
yeah.
making it as difficult as possible.
So the government doesn't come out of this too well, do they?
Well, very badly. And I think one of the things that's been, in a sense, insufficiently looked at is when you go back to 2013, the post office, at a time when all this was blowing up with Second Sight, and there was evidence emerging that the post office, in fact, knew about all the problems that there were with Horizon. That was the time at which the Royal Mail Group was being privatised, and Royal Mail until 2012 had been. The post office had been part of the Royal Mail
Yeah,
Group, and it was one of the biggest flotations by the government in 20 years at the time. Um, the government at that time, it seems to me, well, I mean, it's a complicated subject, but there's an argument that the information about the scale, the prospective scale of the post office scandal, was withheld. And in fact, there was a mention of it in the post office in the Royal Mail prospectus originally, but that was removed. I think to the great advantage of the share issue. That's one aspect of it. Immediately before the litigation in 2018, the Public Accounts Committee was interested, and the National Audit Office was interested in the costs being incurred by the Post Office in this litigation. And there's evidence to suggest that the UKGI, which owns the Post Office, UK Government Investments, a private company which owns
hmm.
the Post Office, was concerned to deflect the inquiries of the National Audit Office from pursuing this. And of course, in absolute terms, if you look at the cost of this litigation, the Post Office was involved in what you might say defending the indefensible
Yeah,
right up until the final wire in December 2019. And had there been greater transparency, and had the government been, as it were, more on the case, if you might put it like that, this might have been stopped a lot earlier. I mean, if you go back to 2015, you've got somebody like a minister, Baroness Neville Rolfe, who was the Post Office Minister at the time. She described in her evidence to Sir Wyn Williams that she felt that she was fighting, quotes,
hmm.
UKGR. Well,
Hmm.
that tells you something about the sort of engagement of probably civil servants with
Yes, that's the
Post
thing, isn't it?
Office,
Yeah, you
um,
know, civil
rather than
service
ministers.
mentality.
Yeah. Well, ministers are very busy people. They don't have the chance to get on top of things properly, let alone take a long view. And the one thing that this entire story was crying out for is for somebody in authority, in an objective and detached position, to take a long view. And that applies to compensation,
Yeah.
but it also applies to the Post Office scandal as a whole. Too many conflicts of interest over too long a period with uh, with no one with sufficient authority to take decisions that would affect things in a positive and constructive way. And I suspect that's going to be one of the themes of Sir Wyn Williams's final reports.
Into the last 2 minutes. So the last question: should anyone go to prison, and will they?
Oh, well, that's a very interesting question. One obviously can't speak about that lightly. What you can say, and what I would say, is that some of the things that happened in this story are miscarriages of justice on an extraordinarily serious scale. And they were engineered. And they
Hmm.
were not engineered in the sense by those who didn't know. They were engineered deliberately and with the intention that the victims should protect the post office and its commercial interests from the reality, which is essentially that it had a commercially bust system. Um, individuals' liberty was perceived by some as a price worth paying to protect the post office's commercial interest and their jobs and their ambitions and aspirations. In my view, to the extent that that was done knowingly, it constitutes perverting the course of justice, and perverting the course of justice is a criminal offence. And if criminal offences have been committed, those who commit them ought to bear the consequences. And it's worth noting that at the moment there is an enormous Metropolitan Police investigation
Underway. Yeah.
nationwide
Yeah.
going on in relation to the those who are involved, and it seems to me some of those involved ought to be culpable. Against that, it can be said that historically, as a country, in comparison, say, with the United States, although that's not necessarily the best example at the moment, we're not very good at holding those who,
No.
in positions of authority in corporations, are held accountable for misdeeds. We're not very.
Regrettably, we've run out of time. I've really